It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com, where our mission is to help accelerate your DFS learning curve and get you over that hump to profitability. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm here today with my partner and co-host Josh Kalachi. Josh, how's it going this morning?
Doing well. Once again, there's another Cub call-up. Last show, you guys remember, was Chris Bryant Day. Today is Addison Russell Day. Now, I'm not saying, once again, start a guy right away as soon as he comes up. We saw what happened to Bryant. Luckily, he did start to hit the ball a little bit. But Addison Russell's coming up. Maybe something else is going to happen tomorrow. Maybe another guy Friday. Seems like the Cubs are calling up guys every time we have a show.
Yeah, do you I didn't hear anything. I mean, I heard that he's coming up. Is he probably going to get the start today? Probably at second base, I'd assume, right?
Yeah, what I saw earlier was the fact that he was going to start at second base. Obviously, the Cubs have Jonathan Herrera there now, who's is not exactly lighting the world on fire at the moment. But it looks like Russell should play second base. He is available on DraftKings, but not on FanDuel. For those of you that are interested in using him today, we'll probably talk about other guys at their position that we like better later. But, yeah, Addison Russell is supposed to start. Now, obviously, be sure to check out the lineups page to make sure that he is in the lineup before you play anyone, just like the rest of our guys.
Yeah, they'll probably, I'm guessing, this is completely a guess right now, but I'm guessing he's probably also going to be hitting probably 6 or 7 in the order. I don't think they're going to throw him up towards the top right away, no?
Yeah, I don't think so. Definitely something we always talk about on here. If you guys are new to the show, we always discuss guys in our lineups. We do like in the top 5, and if a guy's not there, it's tough to use him, especially in a situation with the Cubs matchup today.
Yeah, and he's for those of you who don't know, he's a very big prospect. He's one of the guys that they're looking at down the road. He actually was a big shortstop prospect, but they already have Starlin Castro over there, so they have him playing second base in the minors, figuring that he's going to eventually slot into that second base slot. But that's a really good young infield they're putting together there in Chicago. So Cubs fans definitely have some things to look forward to in the near future for them. But we're going to get into our show outline for today, give you guys a little bit of an idea of what we're going to be going over. As always, we're going to start with the recap. We're going to get into the weather for today, a couple weather situations to watch out for. We're going to move on to the Vegas lines. Josh is going to actually do a teaching point with you guys today, teach you how to use a site called Fangraphs, and give you a couple ideas on why you even want to know about Fangraphs or why you even would like to use it. Then we'll go on and talk about some of the pitchers that we like today, some of the hitters that we like. I'm going to get into a little discussion about multi-position eligibility and how it can be used to your advantage, especially on the sites that have it, DraftKings being one of them, and there's a couple places, I know in Fantasy Aces there's a little bit of overlap that you can use it as well. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about how it can help you build lineups that way. And then, as always, Josh and I will give you our ideas on how we're going to go about getting into our lineup building today and hopefully help you guys build up a winner. So with that, let's before we get into tonight, we're going to go over last night. So, Josh, anything you saw last night you want to let the people know about?
Well, last night was all about Coors Field. It was all about the Padres. San Diego Padres scored 14 runs last night. Now, of course, with those games in Coors Field, we're always targeting those big hitters, but we didn't think it wasn't going to be Tulowitzki or Carlos Gonzalez or Corey Dickerson. It was the Padres. It was Derek Norris, which a lot of people had a lot of shares of last night. It was Will Myers, Will Middlebrooks. All those guys for the Padres, if you were able to stack them in your lineup, there's almost no doubt you won a bunch of money. Also talking about a lot of pitching, I believe DeSclafani, I believe it is, for the Reds, definitely had one of the better days yesterday. I wasn't able to get that complete game shutout after throwing just 91 pitches in 8 innings. But there were some other good pitchers. Trevor Bauer started off cold, but ended up striking a lot of people out. He got robbed of a win, which seems like a little bit of a pattern so far this year in daily fantasy with some top starters. But there was some good pitching. Obviously, the Padres stack yesterday. And Coors Field strikes again, 17 runs in that game, even a triple that pushed some people over the line by Charlie Blackmon in the bottom of the ninth. It was just a meaningless run, but that was about 15 fantasy points for those that had those Rockies in their lineups.
Yeah, for those of you guys who haven't played a lot of daily fantasy MLB, whenever there's a game in Coors Field, it always has some kind of impact on the winners and losers that night. I mean, it's one of those things that it's one of those places where there's a lot of runs scored, and if you don't have any exposure to it, a lot of times you find yourself basically in a bad situation. So last night, the way to have exposure to it was taking the Padres. There were a lot of people who were on the Rockies as well, and as those people know, that kind of fell flat on you. So it's not always the Rockies when they're in Coors Field. Sometimes it's the team they're playing against. Anybody can score runs in that park. So it just matters, basically what side of the coin you're on that night and guessing it right. But with that being said, let's move on and start talking a little bit about tonight. Do you see, before we get into anything, are there any weather issues that we need to be concerned about? I haven't even really looked this morning.
Checking the weather this morning, it didn't look like there were any rain issues. Obviously, there was a big storm last night. For those of us on the East Coast, we saw a lot of thunder, a lot of lightning, rain for about 4 or 5 hours through the night. I know here, I'm not quite sure about what it looks like close to New York.
Yeah,
but there are a lot of wind affecting games today. The Dodgers at the Giants, the wind's blowing out at 10 miles an hour. Atlanta at the Mets, the wind's blowing out at 11 miles an hour. And those are mild considering the rest of these games today. Games like the Cubs at the Pirates at 15-mile-an-hour winds blowing from right to left. This could definitely help some left-handed hitters, but you got to remember, if the wind isn't blowing straight in or out, it's a tough thing for a lot of fly ball pitchers because it'll carry the ball to different parts of the ballpark. Just based on the trajectory of how a normal ball would go, it can affect it, and that's the difference between a home run and an out, as we saw yesterday with a few catchers flying out to deep center field. Some other games, one of the games that I might be targeting because of the wind is Yankees at the Tigers, 17-mile-an-hour winds blowing from right to left. And it's just one of those games where there's a lot of guys that hit a lot of fly balls. There's some power hitters. We always like to look at guys like, I'm sure all of us are familiar with Miguel Cabrera, J.D. Martinez, Yoenis Cespedes. These guys can hit the ball out of the ballpark at any given time. And the wind's actually blowing in their favor today. But my favorite weather of the day, Cleveland at the White Sox, 18-mile-an-hour winds straight out. I know I'm going to be targeting some of those guys. What about you, Benny?
Oh, yeah, there's a couple Cleveland bats that we're going to get into and talk about a little bit later. But before we do that, let me go over the Vegas lines with you guys real quick, give you a couple ideas on how the line makers, the odds makers see these games today. We actually have a couple games today. Today is pretty much a feast or famine kind of day. There's a lot of games with a run total of 7. And there's also a lot of games with a run total of 8.5, 9, and one that even got up to 10. On the low end, you have St. Louis and Washington is a 7.7 run total expected game. The Cubs and the Pirates is another one where they're only expecting 7. The Mets and the Braves, the Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants, and the last one is the Houston Astros and the Seattle Mariners. So you're basically talking about 10 pitchers right there, and games that are expected to give up, 3 or 4 runs or less in each one of those games. So there's going to be a couple guys, maybe not who you originally thought you were going to be targeting, but a couple guys in there who might make some good targets later on today. The games where we should be looking at bets, obviously San Diego and Colorado. It's a 10-run total that it's expected in that one. So you're going to see some runs. You're going to see some people scoring. You're going to see some home runs. That's definitely a game you want to have some exposure to with some of your bets. Arizona and Texas is also a 9-run game. That's the second highest on the day. I actually hadn't been looking at too many bats in that one, so I may need to go back and check that one out and see if there's something I'm missing, seeing if there's a good matchup I might have overlooked there. And then the other two is one that Josh mentioned, the Yankees and Detroit Tigers, expecting 8.5 runs in that one, so that could be another one that would be good to have some exposure to. And the last one is Baltimore and Toronto. And the one thing I wanted to point out, which you guys will start seeing, is if you look at the places where the most runs are expected and the least runs are expected, it goes along with what we were talking about with ballpark factors last time. The places that the most runs are expected today, those games take place in Colorado, one of the best hitters parks in all of baseball, Toronto, which is likely the best hitters park in the American League, Detroit, which is not a bad place to hit. It's not great, but it's not bad either, and Texas, which is another good hitters park. So the 4 games where they're expecting the most runs are all in 4 hitters parks. And then if you go back on the flip side and you look at the games where they're expecting the least runs, you have a game in Washington between Washington and St. Louis. Washington is notorious pitchers park. You have one in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is another notorious pitchers park. You have the Mets and the Braves. I think that one's at Citi Field, but even if it is in Atlanta, I'm not sure right now off the top of my head, but those are both good pitchers parks, so that's another reason. Dodgers and San Francisco was playing in San Francisco. Again, another good pitcher's park. And the last game on the least runs is Houston and Seattle. And Seattle is another notorious pitcher's park. So when we talk about things like ballpark factor, this is what we're talking about here. It may not make a lot of sense to you guys how more runs can be scored in one place than another, but there are some reasons for it. You know, as we got into last time, one of the things that helps a lot of these pitchers in pitchers parks is that there's a lot of room in foul territory. So some of those foul balls that somebody just gets underneath or, you know, just misses by a little bit that wind up being high pop flies down the first base or the third baseline, you know, in some of these pitchers parks, there's enough room, excuse me, there's enough room for those plays to be made. Whereas in some of the other parks where there's not enough room, that's a foul ball and that guy gets another chance to tee off, and, you know, that could be a reason why the run differential in those stadiums. But again, like we said, you know, the ballpark factor is something you guys got to keep an eye on. And, you know, when you look at the Vegas lines, you can see that Vegas definitely looks at it too, and that's a reason why. The last thing I want to get into real quick is who the biggest favorites on the mound are. The biggest favorite on the day is actually Francisco Liriano right now, who's at a -160. So as we said, if you guys had a chance, I put that article up that I promised you this week about using Vegas lines to make some of your picks and to help you build lineups. So you can find that over on the RotoCurve site. And one of the things that we said is you want to try to target pitchers who are big favorites and also in low total games. So that Pittsburgh and Chicago Cubs game is one of the lowest totals on the day at 7, and Liriano is one of the biggest favorites at -160. So that puts Liriano in a really good spot today. You know, he's one of those guys that Vegas is expecting to get a win from, expecting to have, you know, less runs scored, so he's not going to have a lot of negative events. And he's a guy who tends to pitch, you know, 7 innings, 8 innings sometimes, and get, you know, 6 to 8 strikeouts as well. So he has a lot of the positives that we'll get into when we start talking about pitching. The other big favorites on the day, one of them is a guy who I've heard people talk about, and the other two are guys who I definitely haven't heard anybody really mention. The first one is John Neese for the Mets. He's at a -145 today. He's the second biggest favorite on the board, and he's actually tied with Jason Vargas of Kansas City, who's also a -145 favorite. Now, I've heard people mentioning Neese and talking about Neese as a sneaky play today, but I haven't heard anybody talking about Vargas as a sneaky play today. He's not a guy that I love either, but like I said, the idea of looking at these Vegas lines is to kind of get you onto some things that you might not have been looking at originally. So Jason Vargas is definitely a guy after the show that I'm going to have to look deeper into and see if he makes some sense to start. And then the last big favorite of the day at -140 is Chase Anderson of Arizona. This one actually surprised me a little because that's a high total game. They're expecting 9 runs there, and he's going up opposite Nick Martinez, who's been pretty good to start the season. So even though he is a big favorite, I don't think he's a guy who's only going to give up 2 or 3 runs. So he's probably one of those guys that I would probably want to stay away from today. But now that we've gotten the Vegas lines and everything out of there, we talked about the weather, we talked about the Vegas lines. A lot of you have been asking us questions about how we actually get into our research and how we go about doing our research from there. So I'm going to kick it over to Josh for a little bit, and he's going to introduce you guys to a site called Fangraphs and kind of give you a little bit of a background on how he uses that to help build his lineups. So Josh, you want to show the people a little bit about that?
Yeah, what we're going to do here is I'm going to bring up a screen share of Fangraphs.com. It's one of the sites that it's notorious for advanced statistics, but it's not only used for that. As you guys can see right here, we're looking at Fangraphs. This is the main page. One of the first things I like to do each day is you go over to this Teams tab and Team Batting Stats. You click on 2015, it'll bring up all of the team batting stats for the given year. Obviously, it's a low sample size right now with only about 15 games, but as the sample size gets bigger, we'll be able to see more trends. We'll be able to see which teams to start guys against. Now, you're seeing these things you may not recognize, like ISO, like WOBA. Don't worry about that stuff. We're here to teach you about some of the things that you really need to know about right away. And one of the things that many of I talked about is strikeout percentage, and that's exactly what this is right here, K percentage. So if you sort by K percentage, everything on Fangraphs is sortable. It's one of the reasons why I use it as a staple in my research each day. You sort it by K percentage, you can see all of the teams ranked from 1st to 30th in terms of how likely they are to strike out. Right now, the Astros are first with the Orioles, Pirates, Marlins, and Nationals. And what this is you target this on FanDuel in your DraftKings lineups because they get you the bonus. They get you +1 on FanDuel. They get you +2 on DraftKings. It's just a different way to get fantasy points, and it's one of the things we like to target. I like to combine that with what Benny was talking about with the Vegas lines, with the over-unders for each game and different matchups. Now, one of the ways you can find these matchups is another column on this is batting average. So if you click on batting average, it's sorted. It shows you the teams you want to avoid, like the Royals and the Tigers. If you click again, it'll take you to the lowest batting averages per team. That's also the Astros and the Brewers. Now, you might have noticed the Astros are among the top in strikeout percentage and the lowest in batting average. That would make them a target almost every day, depending if you have a good pitcher. Now, one of the things that Fangraphs is good for, I know a lot of people like to use Excel. We use it almost every day in our daily lives now. You see this thing where it says export data? You can use that to make an Excel file. It exports into a called a CSV, and you can use that open in your Microsoft Excel on pretty much any computer. You can use this to do whatever you want with these tables. Now, you might be asking yourself, what are all these numbers and I don't need them? Why can I get them away? Well, that's one of my favorite things about Fangraphs, and you can scroll all the way down to custom leaderboards, and you can just control or you click and hold and just delete all these things. And all of these numbers to the left are numbers you can choose from to have in a table that looks similar to what we are looking at up here. Now, you can use these to determine what you think is most important for me and for Benny, and a lot of different things we like to look at in targeting opposing offenses. You look at things like batting average. You look at things like line drives or K percentage. I like to look at line drive percentage, ground ball fly percentage, and fly ball percentage. You don't necessarily have to add those, but it's something I like to do each day for my research. And what that is kind of self-explanatory. It's the percent chance that, or the percentage of times that an opposing team is hitting line drives, hitting ground balls, hitting fly balls. So if you do this and you hit Create Custom Table, it'll bring you to a separate table like we just looked at, but it only has the things that you need. And that's when you want to hit Export Data, and you can use it to do whatever you need in your spreadsheet, or you can look at it here if you don't have enough time to go to your spreadsheet. That's the best part about Fangraphs. You can sort by K percentage. And one of the things that I like to target, and we've talked about it before, is the team has a low batting average, team that has a high strikeout percentage. They're not hitting very many line drives, but their fly ball rate is high. And we always talk about fly balls can turn into home runs. That's another stat that we'll talk about in another show or later today. But if you target teams with high strikeout percentages, line drive percentages, I usually like to target 20% or lower, and high ground ball rates, it just translates to outs and strikeouts, which is exactly what we like to target in daily fantasy baseball. And it's one thing that we like to use to find pitchers. Now, depending on what the pitcher's price is and obviously other factors, that's something we do like to use a lot. But this is just another tool you can use for your lineups, and it's something that I use every day. Benny, do you use anything on Fangraphs, or do you think you have any other questions that other people might be considering?
I actually do not use Fangraphs all that much, but this is pretty interesting. Let me actually ask you a couple questions, because this might be something that could help me with my own research. Is there a way on there to sort it by how they do against right-handed pitching, left-handed pitching per se? Is there a way to break that down, the strikeout percentage and all that?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that, and that's one of the things that you can do on there. You see where on pretty much every part of the site right here, you will see splits. You will see full season. You will see last 14 days. You can click on individual players. Like, for example, a guy that we're going to be talking about today is Adam Jones, which we will discuss more later. But if you go to the top and you type in Adam Jones, you can click on his profile. It will bring you to every statistic you can possibly think of, including things that we won't even have to worry about. But if you go here, it says season stats and splits. So you can click on splits. Okay. From here, you can go down to career any year. Obviously, with a low sample size this year, it's a little bit difficult to see. Now, obviously, Adam Jones, if you're looking here, it's highlighted. He's hitting 750 against lefties this year, which is something we'll talk about. But if you click on career numbers, you'll be able to see how a guy is doing over a large sample size. Adam Jones sitting 273 against left-handed pitchers. Last year, you can click on that as well, and you'll be able to see how a guy did against left-handed pitching over a full year. And that's 344, which is something we have mentioned on this show. There's also other ways you can go into that, like the previous charts, discussing ways that you can use to make an entire custom leaderboard showing your splits against left-handed pitching, against right-handed pitching. It's all customizable, and that's one thing I like to use because that's what daily fantasy research is. It's all about customizing. So be sure to check out Fangraphs.com next time you're doing your research. and it's something that we always like to use. So now that we've got into that, let's talk about the guys for today. Benny, do you have any certain pitchers you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot of pitchers that are kind of on my radar today. The top guy that I think I'm going to go with, though, as I mentioned before, is going to be Francisco Liriano. The reason why I like Liriano, as we mentioned already, he's in the lowest total game and he's the biggest favorite on the day. So he's got a good chance for a win, which, depending on what site you play, could be a very large portion of the overall points scored that he gets for you. If you listen to Michael Rathburn this morning on his DFS Minute, Rath kind of talked about, especially on a site like FanDuel, that the win is so important because it could be 10 to 12% of your overall winning score. So if you have a score somewhere in the 30 to 40 range, that is usually what it takes to get you into those, into the money in those 50-50s and to help you win a lot of those head-to-head matches that you have. The amount of points that you get for a win, the 4 points you get, is basically 10% of that total score. If you get 36, it could be closer to 12% of that total score that you wind up with. So it's definitely important to target guys that can win. So Liriano's a guy who's in the game. He's expected to win. He's the highest, the highest favorite on the day. He's also a guy that I like because of the other stats that you can get points for in daily fantasy. He usually goes about 7 innings a game at a minimum, so he's going to be racking up some points for the innings, and he also usually gets somewhere between 6 or 8 strikeouts in those 7 innings. So altogether, when you add everything up that he has on his day for him, he's probably looking at somewhere around 15 FanDuel points, probably somewhere around 23 to 27 DraftKings points. And at the price point that he is today, if you can get either one of those things out of him, he's going to wind up being one of the better starts on the day. But there are also some other guys. Another guy who I like and I'm seeing a lot of people talk about around the industry is Colin McHugh from Houston. I know Rath is real big on him. He's been a high strikeout guy lately, and he's looked really, really good when he's on the mound. He pitches in Seattle, which is a great pitcher's park, so it's not anything he's got to worry about. He's actually getting a park bump moving over from the Astrodome or whatever they call that stadium down there right now in Houston. So I think both of those guys are going to be some of the higher-owned guys on the day, but they're also some of the guys who I think you should target. They're probably 2 of my favorite high-end pitchers. Now, I know that you also had some other options. What did you find looking through FanGraphs? What kind of pitchers did they point out to you today?
Well, I just talked about I like to look at a lot of guys that have high strikeouts and high ground ball rates, but I'm kind of going against the grain today a little bit in most of my 50-50 and head-to-head matchups with Lance Lynn. I like Lance Lynn against the Nationals today. Nationals are below average in nearly every offensive category this season, have high strikeout rate, low batting average. They're not hitting righties well. They're striking out the 5th most in the MLB so far this season, and I just mentioned they're hitting just 226 as a team. In addition, they're one of the teams that ground out a lot, and that's something that I like to target. I think it's something a lot of people should target because if you watch the game of baseball, you study the game of baseball, you play the game of baseball, you know that a ground ball most likely translates to an out. It's just playing the percentages. There's 4 infielders. A ground ball shooting through the hole is a very slim chance. But Lynn doesn't give up a ton of ground balls. He's more of a fly ball pitcher. But in his career, he has always had a higher ground ball rate than fly ball rate. This year, it's been a little bit different, but as we always talk about, it's just a small sample size so far. So I do like Lynn to possibly strike out a few batters, go deep into the game. He does pitch to contact, which Benny and I talk about a lot. Now, that sometimes could hurt your strikeout rates, but if you're getting a pitcher going 7 or 8 innings because he has a low pitch count, it's just going to give you more of an opportunity to score fantasy points. That's a lot of the reason why I like Lynn today. Another guy with Benny and I always talk about checking off all the boxes. We talk about guys that have good matchups, they're the favorite in Vegas, that have low over-under, good park factor. The only thing that Travis Wood today doesn't check is the matchups in terms of lefty pitcher, which Wood is against a right-handed hitting lineup in the Pirates, and that's why I can only use him in tournament play. If he was right-handed, and I know this sounds a little bit far-fetched, but it's true, I would be using him in my 50-50 games today. The only reason is because Wood gives up a lot of hits to left-handed pitching, but the Pirates or to right-handed hitting, my apologies, the Pirates do not hit very well this season against either side so far. They're one of the worst offensive in baseball, and we just talked about the Nationals are below average in nearly all of the offensive categories. The Pirates are below average in all the offensive categories. The only reason why I can't use Wood in in 50-50s or in head-to-heads, is because the Pirates do have a right-handed hitting lineup, and Wood does struggle at times against righties. But I do like him in a tournament play because he does have a nice matchup in terms of the macro scheme, and that's exactly what we want to look at. And he won't be as expensive as some of the other top guys, so he'll give you more cap space to use on those top hitters, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, that's going to be next up for us on the show right now. We're going to get into our hitters a little bit with you. I'm going to go over a little teaching point with you guys on lineup construction and multi-position eligibility and how it can help you. And then, as always, we're going to end with our thoughts on tonight's slate. So let's get into it. Last night was a big night for hitters, especially if you had some of those San Diego bats in your lineup. And I know there's a San Diego catcher that you wanted to talk about again today. So why don't you take it away and let the people know why Derek Norris should be in their lineups?
Yeah, Norris was a guy last night that, quote from one of the better players in the daily fantasy industry, is a guy named Davis Maddock, who you may or may not be familiar with. He said yesterday that Derek Norris was free money, and boy was he. He's one of the cheaper catchers in terms of what we were expecting from production and what he was able to produce. He had about 21 fantasy points, I think, on DraftKings, and I think he had close to 8 or 7 on FanDuel. But one of the things we like to target with catchers is guys that can hit in the top of that lineup, and for some reason that's what Norris has been doing, and it's not making any of us complain, especially given his price on DraftKings and FanDuel. Whenever there's a left-handed starter, Norris is almost just a plug-and-play. I mean, at this point, last year I believe he was hitting well over 320 against lefties. Actually, I have the number here. It's 311 off lefties last year. He's 9 for 13 this year against left-handed pitching. Of course, that's a really small sample size, but come on, 9 for 13 is incredible. He's one of the guys that I'm targeting in all my lineups today. He should be more expensive than he is, especially on FanDuel. He's over $3,000 over there, which is a lot less than the average you can spend on each position. And you can get a lot of value if you use him. And he's probably going to bat second against a left-handed pitcher like Tyler Matzek, who Benny talked about last week as a guy that has extreme splits. He gets lefties out, but not righties, and that's exactly what Derek Norris can do. So it's kind of a check in every box. Oh, don't forget, he's playing at Coors Field today, too. That park factor, that spot in the lineup, his ability to hit left-handed pitching, he's checking all the boxes off for everybody. So there's no reason why he shouldn't be in your lineups, my lineups, and everybody's lineups. Make sure you're along for the ride.
Yeah, I'm going to actually mention a second guy at catcher, but before I do that, I'm going to agree 100% with everything that Josh just said. If you're playing in a cash game today, especially on FanDuel, because he's very, very cheap on FanDuel. He's not expensive on DraftKings either. I think he's $3,800 or $3,900 today. So he's probably, right in that little middle tier, maybe somewhere between like 6th to 10th most expensive. But if you're playing on FanDuel and you're not using Derek Norris, then you're not doing it right, because he's just too good of a matchup for you to pass over. And the price that he has and the salary savings that he allows you to have on it, I mean, he is basically the guy that you should be using. We like to talk about cash game lineups. You can go a different way in a GPP, and I'll give you a guy to think of that might be 2 guys actually to think of that might help you that way. But if you're playing in cash games tonight, just do yourself a favor. If he's batting second again and he's in the lineup, just plug him into your lineup and then work around it from there. I mean, he's as free a square as you can possibly get. He'll have a good matchup, like Josh said. He's in a good park. He faces a pitcher who struggles against the kind of hitter he is. He's one of the best hitters from that side against pitchers that are left-handed. I mean, there's really no drawbacks to this guy. Now, again, he could go out and go 0 for 4 tonight, but you know what? On paper, he's just so much the best play, and in a lot of the cash games, he's going to be the guy that all the sharp players have. So you might as well have him too, because at the very worst, it's going to be a wash, and your Derek Norris and their Derek Norris is going to cancel each other out. Because if you didn't have him last night, and you tried to go a different way, spend up for Victor Martinez or go down for some of the cheap guys, you basically spotted your opponent 7, 8, 9 points on FanDuel and, almost 20 points, I think, on DraftKings. So it's not worth it to go crazy. Use Derek Norris. But if you are playing GPPs and you're looking for something a little different, Joe Mauer actually has a pretty good matchup. He hits third for the Twins. They're going up against Jason Vargas, who's a left-handed pitcher, but he's actually struggled a little bit with left-handed batters. So if you're looking for a guy that could be differentiated and is basically the same price for you on DraftKings, Mauer would be one of those guys. And then, as always, if you got money to spend up, Buster Posey, who's the most expensive catcher on DraftKings, I think, and probably on FanDuel as well, he's in a righty-lefty matchup. He's a right-handed hitter who's going to be getting a left-handed pitcher. Not the greatest ballpark, but it is his home ballpark where he's played before, and he's hit pretty well there. So if you were looking to go a different way, you can. But to be perfectly honest with you, if you're not using Derek Norris, then you're not doing it right, because for cash games, he is the safest guy that you can use today with the most upside as well. So even in GPPs, I think I'd plug him in, and just work my way around him. His price is too good to ignore. But with that being said, I talked about Mauer and his game against Kansas City. I know there's a former Kansas City first baseman that you like today. You want to tell the people a little bit about that?
Yeah, before I do that, you mentioned a good point about starting Derek Norris and how he's an excellent play. He checks all the boxes, per se. But you said he may go 0 for 4, but that doesn't matter. That's something that we always like to stress when we're doing our research, when we're selecting our lineups. It's not about the results. It really isn't. It's about the process. It's about making sure you're selecting the right guys and you have the right reasons for selecting these guys. If a guy has a terrible matchup and he goes 4 for 4 home runs, so be it. But we're not after that. We're not after throwing darts and trying to find those guys that, like last year, Nick Punto hit 2 home runs in a game. We're not after trying to find those. We're after trying to find these guys that can have great matchups, that have a high likelihood to get a hit, to get a home run, and that's what we're targeting, and that's why Derek Norris is a great play today. Now, that being said, the next step in our research, which is what we like to call the process, is first base. My guy is that former Kansas City Royal, Billy Butler. Butler crushes lefties, and Hector Santiago is pitching for the Angels tonight, who is a left-handed pitcher. For his career, across about 7 years in the major leagues, Billy Butler is hitting .315 against left-handers. Now, obviously, Butler's been one of the better pure hitters we've seen. He's hit close to 300 for his entire career. But one of the things we like to target in daily fantasy is guys that can get those extra bases, that can get doubles, that can get home runs. And Butler has twice as much power against southpaws. He's hitting a home run at twice the rate as he was against righties, as he is against lefties. So be sure to get him into your lineup in a good split today. He's not as expensive as some of the other top first base options, but he has one of the top the top matchups for the day. Also, Butler is hitting 4th. Now, he's not a traditional 4 hitter. There's a lot of guys in the MLB that hit 30 home runs, that hit 40 home runs if they're given a good chance. But Butler's going to get you RBI. He's going to get you hits. He's going to get you fantasy points, and that's the reason why I like him today, because Santiago is not very good against right-handed pitching or right-handed hitters, and any hitters at that given reason, and Butler is one of the better hitters on the day given his matchup. So 2 guys that are relatively similar kind of hitters and similar body types if you're watching those 2 guys play, Derek Norris and Billy Butler. I'm going for those farmers. I mean, I look like one myself.
Well, hopefully those 2 work out for you. I actually have another first baseman who I've been using a little bit lately, and I'm going to be on him again today, and that's the Lucas Duda of the Mets. Now, Duda's been very hot to start the season. He's been flashing some power, and it's real, and he's also been hitting the ball, getting on base pretty well. He hits right in the middle of that Mets order. He's been a 3-hitter lately. I expect to see a little bit of juggling around in that Mets lineup. I think there's a chance that he could get dropped to the 4 hole, which would actually just give him some more RBI opportunities. And the reason I say that is I think basically the Mets are going to have to try to do something to break up all the lefties that they want to put at the top of the order. And the way they had done that is putting d'Arnaud in the 2 hole. But I don't think that that's an option anymore, obviously, with d'Arnaud being out. So I'm thinking they may move Murphy up in the lineup a little bit, but just keep an eye on where he's hitting. But for the most part, he should be hitting somewhere around that 2, 3, 4 spot in the lineup. As I said, Duda's got a lot of power. He's a left-handed bat. He goes up against Trevor Cahill, who's kind of a weak righty, who's been getting hit by left-handed who's been getting hit by left-handed batters so far this season and last season as well. The park is not the greatest as they're playing in, I think that one's at home in Citi Field, which isn't the greatest hitter's park in the world. But Duda has been pretty hot. He has been getting on base, and he has been flashing a little bit of power. And the other thing I really like about him is on DraftKings, he's only $3,600. So he's one of the cheaper first base options that you can put in there. And there are some other positions today that I want to spend up at. So if you want to spend up in other spots, you got to make sure you have a guy there. I'm not somebody who likes to use cheap first basemen that don't have upside, because first base is a power position that somebody usually winds up getting a home run at. Somebody usually winds up having a 3 for 5 day with 3 or 4 RBIs. So you really can't just kind of disregard first base and take some guy who's cheap and hope that he has a good game. But with Duda, you kind of get the best of both worlds because lately he has been producing like one of the top-end options, but yet his price is still priced like he's one of the lower-end options. So on a day like today where there are some expensive guys that I'm trying to fit into my lineup in different spots for hitters, I think using a guy like Lucas Duda is a way to get some of that salary relief without giving up too much of the upside. Now, I know there's second base is actually one of those positions today where there are a lot of guys that you might want to pay up for and get into your lineup. I'm going to kick it over to Josh, who has one that he wants to discuss, and it goes kind of hand in hand with the weather situation we were talking about earlier. So, Josh, you want to get into that with people?
Yeah, about that weather earlier, we were talking about that Cleveland game. The wind is blowing straight out, and that's why I'm targeting one of the lefties who does play second base. He is eligible there, and he's worth paying up for today. Betty and I talked before the show about who we were going to like at second base, and I don't think you should look any farther than Jason Kipnis if you are spending up. He's left-handed batter against Hector Noesi, who has struggled mightily, for lack of better words, against these left-handed batters. If you do choose to spend up at other positions, now I know there are a lot of expensive outfielders that are worth taking today, which we'll get to in a little bit. You can kind of pivot down a little bit, and what a pivot means is it's just a swap. We're going down to Neil Walker, who's a switch hitter, against Travis Wood. Wood does get lefties out a lot, but as we just talked about before, and it's the reason why I can't use him in my 50-50s and head-to-heads, he struggles against righties, and Walker can hit right-handed. He is a switch hitter, and he has some power from both sides of the plate. Now, he does have a lot more power from the left side, but he's still one of the stronger second basemen in the game, and he can definitely hit the ball out of the ballpark. So if you're looking for just an upside at second base for a guy that can hit a home run, Neil Walker is that guy, and he probably won't be very highly owned because a lot of people will be on Kipnis. Is there a second baseman or shortstop or outfielder, which we'll talk about just a little bit, that you like today?
Yeah, there's actually two guys that I've been targeting at second base to use, and as Josh kind of alluded to, one of them has multi-position eligibility, so I'm going to be using him in a different spot, but we'll talk about him here, and I'll talk about multi-position eligibility when we get to the other spot you can use him in. The first guy is a guy who I just mentioned when I was talking about Duda, and that's Daniel Murphy of the Mets. It's pretty much the same situation. He's a left-handed batter. He gets Cahill. Cahill struggles. He's a right-handed pitcher. He struggles with left-handed batters. So if you can find some of those left-handed batters that hit right-handed pitching well, Duda is one of them. Daniel Murphy's another one. The only other one on the Mets who kind of interests me a little bit is Curtis Granderson, but I don't like Curtis Granderson's lack of consistency, for a better way of explaining it. So if you're looking for a cash game play, I think the guys to go with on the Mets are Murphy and Duda. So Murphy's a guy at second base I like. But the guy who I really like at second base is Dee Gordon today. And let me explain to you why. Dee Gordon is going to be playing against the Phillies. He goes up against Jerome Williams. Jerome Williams is a right-handed pitcher, really struggles with left-handed bats. And he doesn't really struggle giving up the home run, but he does struggle giving up the hits. Left-handed bats have a pretty high on-base percentage against him. And for a guy like Dee Gordon, that's exactly what you want at the top of the lineup. I don't care if he gives up a lot of fly ball home runs. I really care that he gives up a lot of base runners to left-handed batters. So that basically means to me that there's a good chance Dee Gordon's going to get on base at least once, maybe even 2 or 3 times today. And the other part of that, as I always tell you guys and as I showed you last time, is you can look up how catchers do when they're trying to throw runners out. Carlos Ruiz so far this year, 4 guys, or actually 5 after the other day, 5 guys have tried to steal on him. All 5 guys have been safe. So far base stealers are 5 for 5 against Ruiz. If you look back in history, he's not a guy who has a high percentage of throwing out runners. So if Dee Gordon does get on today, there's a good chance that he could go and take a base. So as we always say, one of the best ways to get points is if a guy can get you a single or a walk, steal second base, and then have some of the big bats behind him knock him in for a run scored. Now, I do want to throw a caveat out there for you guys, just something that Wrath and I were actually talking about the other day and going over the numbers for. At second base or on DraftKings, guys who can steal bases are worth more than they are on a site like FanDuel or even a site like Fantasy Aces, because DraftKings gives you a lot of points for those stolen bases. So if you look at some of the outfielders, the way we got onto this the other day is he was looking at the DraftKings outfielder rankings for a guy like Denard Span, who just came back. And Span is a guy who gets a lot of hits and steals a couple bases, scores a lot of runs. He's ranked much higher on DraftKings in the overall scoring than he is on FanDuel. And as we said, the reason for that is on DraftKings, if you can get that single, steal that base, and score a run, you basically wind up with 10 points for that at bat. if you have a guy who hits an RBI double and then has somebody knock him in to score a run, he only winds up with 9 points. So getting that guy who can get on base, steal that base, and then come around is actually, that at bat is actually worth more for you if D. Gordon does that than if a guy like Yelich or Stanton hitting behind them does hit that double and knock him in, and then has somebody behind them hit a double to, bring them around for the run score. The run scored, the RBI, and the double are going to get you 9 points, whereas the single, the stolen base, and the run scored are going to get you 10. So if you're looking, where you want to spend up, some people might look at D. Gordon's price and think he's a little bit too expensive today. But when you look at it under the light of he's a guy who should be able to get on base more than once today, and he's a guy when he does get on that's going to have a chance to steal against somebody who hasn't thrown anybody out this year and had one of the lower percentages of throwing people out last year if Ruiz does get the start again, you got to figure that there's a lot of upside for him today. There's not a lot of second basemen that are going to hit multiple home runs and get you 20 points that way. But if D. Gordon has 2 singles, 2 stolen bases, and 2 runs scored, he's going to get you that same 20 points that you would be looking for. So he's a guy that I really like today at second base, somebody who I think you should consider. For those of you who watch the show, I know that I have mentioned him before, and he's paid off for us before. He's one of those guys that I think just kind of goes under the radar, and especially for your cash game, it's a lot easier to predict a stolen base than it is to predict a home run. So I think it's a lot safer to use somebody like that in a cash game, looking for the high upside of it. But speaking of guys who are in good spots and have high upside, Josh, you want to tell people who you're on at third base today? Because he's a guy who I had last night and I'm considering using again today.
Yeah, Will Middlebrooks is a third baseman for the Padres today. He's hitting in the middle of that lineup who right now just scoring runs at will. Scored 14 runs last night against the Rockies, and they're also are facing the Rockies again tonight in Coors Field, which we always talk about in terms of the park factor, given the benefit to the hitters no matter what. Yesterday, one of the guys in the industry, Derek Carty, was on Baseball Tonight and ESPN, and he talked about how the Rockies are first in almost every category that responds to park factor, runs allowed over the average, home runs, total bases, and that's exactly what we like to target. And Middlebrooks does have a lot of power. He can hit the ball out of the ballpark. One of the things we like to look at, and we always talk about, is these left-handed splits, is these right-handed splits. And Middlebrooks is hitting 35 points higher against lefties in his career. He's facing Tyler Matzek, which we detailed earlier, and he is left-handed, and he gives up a lot of hits to righties. Middlebrooks is another one of these guys, just like Derek Norris, who checks off all the boxes. And he's not very expensive today, so that's why I'm going to be using him at third base. You can spend up on outfield, which we'll get to in a little bit. Benny, you on him or you on somebody else as well?
Well, like I said, I do like Middlebrooks as well. He is a guy that I'm going to be having in my lineup, so I do agree with you there. But there is another guy who's interesting to me as well, and that's Josh Harrison of the Pittsburgh Pirates. Harrison hits leadoff for the Pirates. He's a right-handed batter, and he gets to go up against Travis Wood today, who's a left-handed pitcher that Josh had mentioned earlier. Last year, Harrison hit .304 against left-handed pitching. He's going to be on top of that Pirates order, and there are some big bats behind them, guys like Marte, McCutchen, who can knock him in if he does get on base. His price is pretty reasonable. He's only about $4,300 on DraftKings today, so he's another guy who I think is interesting. Personally, I'm going to be using Middlebrooks because, like Josh said, there's a lot of outfielders today that I think people are going to want to pay up for. There's some big bats that are in really good spots that you're going to want. So Harrison is a good option. He's somebody that I might throw into some of my GPP lineups. Over on DraftKings, they have the $500,000 Slugfest today, which a lot of the qualifying tournaments have been running for the last couple of weeks. So I have a couple tickets over there. I'm probably going to mix in a little bit of Josh Harrison on some of those just to be different. But again, like we say, for cash games, you want the safest points at the best price that you can get, and Middlebrooks is hitting fifth in that order. He's a right-handed batter going up against a left-handed pitcher in Coors Field, one of the best hitters parks in baseball. I mean, 10-run total on that game. It's just there's a lot of positives in his corner. So for a cash game, if you're looking to save a couple bucks, which you should be so you can spend up in other spots, Middlebrooks makes for a great option today. Just like we said with Norris before, Middlebrooks is in basically the same kind of situation. He's a right-handed batter that rakes against left-handed pitching, and he's definitely a guy that you should be considering for your cash game lineups. But that brings us on to shortstop. So which way are we going at shortstop? Shortstop seems to be a pretty tough position today.
Yeah, it brings us to another teaching point. Obviously, I told you guys about Fangraphs earlier and stuff that it can bring us, but this other teaching point is very interesting and used to, especially on DraftKings, when you can put guys in different slots. You've noticed that some players have second base / outfield. Some players have second base / shortstop. So what exactly does that mean? Benny's going to detail a play we both like and why we like them at certain positions as opposed to other positions. Benny, can you tell everybody about multi-position eligibility and how to use that to your advantage?
Yeah, multi-position eligibility is something that you guys need to understand. It's not on every single site. If you play on FanDuel, FanDuel pretty much lists players at one position. They're either going to be a first baseman or a catcher or a second baseman or a third baseman, and they pretty much just decide which position that guy plays most often and put him there. Over on DraftKings, though, the guys have multi-position eligibility, and before we really get into it, let me explain to you why they do that. Let's say you want to stack the Detroit Tigers. Well, in the American League, they have a DH, and over on DraftKings, there really is no utility position, so you can't use a DH in a utility. So they have to give that guy a position. So if you wanted to stack the Tigers, two of the guys who you're going to want in that Tiger stack are probably Miguel Cabrera and Victor Martinez. Now, if you look at them, Cabrera is listed as a first baseman or a third baseman, and Victor Martinez is listed as a catcher or a first baseman. So you can only use one of those two guys in the first base slot, or technically you could actually not use either one of them. You could have Martinez as your catcher and, you know, put Miggy over at third base for you. But it's a way for you to be able to fit some of these guys into your lineup who also DH. Now, the reason why multi-position eligibility is important is it opens up your roster to a lot of flexibility when you're building these rosters. And to get back to the point of what Josh was saying originally is the guy who we've both been using at shortstop on DraftKings today is D. Gordon, who we just mentioned. Now, Gordon is one of those guys who is second base and shortstop eligible. There's another one in a good spot today in Brian Dozier, who's also second base and shortstop eligible. The other day, Hanley Ramirez is outfield and shortstop eligible. Guys like Billy Hamilton also fall into that shortstop and outfield eligible role as well. So if you can get guys like that who are, you know, basically some of the better hitters in the league or some of the guys who are in better spots, and you can put them in a position that's usually tough to fill, you know, it's going to be a positive boost for your roster. And here's basically how you guys can use it to your advantage. And I'll explain it to you how it happened to me when I was building my lineups last night. When I got to second base, I had a tough time deciding between guys like Kipnis and Daniel Murphy and D. Gordon, because they're all guys who I thought were in good spots, even a Brian Dozier. And if you plug D. Gordon into your lineup at second base, then when you get to shortstop, you're looking through the list, and there might not be any shortstops there at the same price point that you really like. Kipnis was a little bit expensive, but I like Kipnis more than I like the shortstops that I would have to pay up for at that same price. Same thing with Daniel Murphy. Daniel Murphy was a little bit of a discount, but if you look at Daniel Murphy versus the shortstops you can get for that same price point, Daniel Murphy was a much better option. So when you're building your lineup, if you get to shortstop and you don't like anybody that you could put in there, but the guy who you had plugged in at outfield or second base also has that shortstop eligibility, you can move that guy over to cover that spot that's going to be tougher for you to fill. So in our case today, that would be D. Gordon. If there's a guy that you didn't like at shortstop, you couldn't find someone you like, instead of using D. Gordon at second base, or instead of using Hanley Ramirez in the outfield or Billy Hamilton in the outfield, you can plug that guy in at shortstop. And then with that same amount of money that you would have left over, the $3,800 or the $3,900 you were looking to get a shortstop with, you can now use that $3,900 or look under second base or look under outfield for a guy who costs $3,900 who you might like better than the options you can get at second base. So remember, if you have a guy who you're going to use today and you can plug him into multiple positions in your lineup, it opens you up to a bigger pool of players that you can take with him. So like I said, I didn't like any of the shortstops, so I moved D. Gordon from second base to shortstop to open up some of those other plays at second base that I liked. And then depending on how I was building the rest of the roster, I was able to fit in a Daniel Murphy or a Jason Kipnis, who were two guys at second base that I liked better than who I could have gotten for that same price point at shortstop. So when you get yourself into a position where you have a guy who has multi-position eligibility, make sure you do try to work him around and finagle your roster, because you may not like somebody that you have in another spot, but if you can move him, you know, if you have Miguel Cabrera at first base and you don't like the third baseman that you have, but there's another first baseman that you like, you can move Miguel Cabrera over to that third base spot and then get both of the first basemen that you liked on a day. Same thing works with Victor Martinez. If you can move him into catcher because you don't like any of the guys that you had to plug into catcher today, Well, then maybe with that same price point, you can find another first baseman that you like, and it's just going to give you a better overall roster. It's going to give your roster a higher chance to get that score that you need in order to win those 50-50s and those head-to-heads, and even gives you more upside in a GPP, because a lot of times people are going to be stuck using a guy like D. Gordon at second base where they, think of him as a second baseman. But if you put him in at shortstop and put another one, your roster is going to be different than other people's, because you're basically going to have two guys that play the second base position where they didn't think about, finagling their roster around to be able to fit it there. So that's basically an idea of multi-position eligibility and how you guys can use it to help your rosters. Hopefully it's something that you'll take into consideration when you're building your rosters, because it has definitely opened up some avenues for me to get some of the guys, or to fit in multiple guys I like when there are multiple guys that play the same position that I want to try to have in my lineups these days. But moving on from that, we're getting up to the end of the show. We got about 10 minutes left. I really wanted to talk about outfield today, Josh, and put some time into it, because there's a lot of outfielders that I think are in really good spots. I know there's a couple from the same team that you really like. Do you want to get into that with the people?
Yeah, we've talked about the Padres so far a lot today, and for obvious reasons. They have a right-handed heavy lineup, and three of their righties and three of their big boppers are all outfielders: Matt Kemp, Justin Upton, and Will Myers. Each of these three outfielders have a chance to hit a home run, and they all crush the ball against left-handed pitching. But one that kind of sticks out is Matt Kemp, and he would be my first pick of the three. He's hitting .334 in his career against left-handed batters. And the thing is he's very expensive, but he's worth paying for, as what we always talk about, checks all the boxes. It's a perfect storm for him. Upton and Will Myers are a little bit cheaper, so if you want to move away from Kemp and have more money to spend on other outfielders or other positions, go with them. But I'm targeting Kemp as my top Padres outfielder. There's one guy that we both like, and I think he's one of the plays of the day. We talked about him last week as he was the play of the day. I know there's a ton of numbers that I can run off on why we like him, but Benny, what do you like so much about Adam Jones?
Yeah, well, I mean, Josh actually already kind of mentioned it when he was going over the Fangraphs with you guys. Adam Jones is somebody who absolutely smashes left-handed pitching. He gets Mark Buehrle today, who's a left-handed pitcher. Buehrle's not a horrible pitcher, but he's also not great at this stage of his career anymore. He's not somebody I'm going to be afraid of. And to top it all off, that's one of the highest run total games today. And they're playing in Toronto, which, as much as we talk about Coors Field is not the only hitter's park in the major league. Toronto is another one. The Rogers Center in Toronto is another place where, hitters absolutely go nuts, and especially right-handed batters. Right-handed batters tend to smash when they're up in the Rogers Center. So you're getting Adam Jones, who's been absolutely hot, who's been absolutely on fire over the course of his career against left-handed pitching. And on top of it, he's hitting in a good ballpark for hitters today. So basically, he's one of those guys that, like we always say, he checks off all the boxes today. He hits in a good spot in the order. He's going to have a couple guys in front of him who can get on base, a couple guys behind him who can drive him in. He's got a lot of power. He's in a park that yields a lot of home runs. He is a little bit expensive. He's not somebody who's cheap. You're definitely going to have to pay up for him. But I think the fact that he is expensive is going to keep his ownership level down a little bit. And like we said, he checks off all the boxes today. So while everybody else is concentrating on fitting in those bats from the Rockies, trying to get everybody in Coors Field, I'm going to be looking up at that game in Toronto, and Adam Jones is going to be the one guy who I'm squarely looking at up there. But there's some other outfielders that are also in good spots, which is why I said I wanted to take a little bit of time to discuss some of them today. Another guy I really like is Michael Brantley. To discuss what we were talking about earlier today, the wind is blowing out in that game in Chicago. U.S. Cellular Field is a field that usually yields a lot of power numbers to left-handed batters, and Hector Noesi is a right-handed pitcher who struggles against batters from the left side. Michael Brantley hits third for the Cleveland Indians. He's a guy who absolutely crushed right-handed pitching last year. He hits them for power. He hits them for average. He has a high on-base percentage against those right-handed pitchers. So he's definitely somebody who's in play. Again, U.S. Cellular Field is a field that yields a lot of home runs to left-handed batters as well. Left-handed power hitters tend to do pretty well there. So that's definitely a matchup that I think that you can look to target. And it's also a little bit under the radar. It's not going to be the stack that most people are on. So I think you can get Brantley at a little bit of a discount in his ownership than some of the other guys there. And the third and final guy that I want to mention is somebody who always goes under-owned. I like him for cash, and I love him for GPPs because of the fact that he goes under-owned, and that's going to be Lorenzo Cain from Kansas City. Cain gets a left-handed pitcher and Tommy Milone. He's a right-handed batter, one of the few right-handed batters in the middle of that Kansas City order. He should be batting third today. He absolutely crushes left-handed pitching. I am not a fan of Tommy Milone. I don't think that he's a guy who's going to repeat that one good game that he had already this year. So I think he's somebody who Kansas City can get to. One thing I really like about that Kansas City Royals team is they don't beat themselves. They don't strike out. They put the ball in play. They force you to make plays against them. And Kane is one of the big bats that they have in the middle of that lineup. So if some of those guys in front of him can get on, I think he's got a good chance to, put some power numbers in there, some doubles, some extra base hits, maybe even a home run if he gets a chance. And I think he's going to be one of those guys that has a lot of upside today. I think he's safe for your cash games, and I also think that he's got the upside for GPPs. So he's a guy who's going to be lower owned, definitely a good GPP play for you because he'll be lower owned, but he's also a guy who's got some safety, so he's definitely a good cash game play as well. So those are just some of the outfielders. There are a lot of other guys that are in good spots too. I mentioned Granderson before as a price saver. Christian Yelich is in a good spot today. A lot of people were talking about Giancarlo Stanton. I know Josh and I were talking about him a little bit before the show. There's a ton of outfielders today that you guys could use. And that's kind of why the reason we gave you a couple options at the other positions that are a little bit of cost savings, because I think today is definitely a day that you're going to want to pay up and get some of those big outfield bats into your lineup for you. So basically that's our rundown of who we like today. Josh, why don't you give the people an idea about how you're going to be going and building your rosters tonight for your 50-50 games and your head-to-heads?
Well, first things first, as we always talk about, you got to find those pitching, those two pitchers you like on DraftKings and that one guy you're going with on FanDuel. And the guy I'm going with in the 50-50s and head-to-heads is a guy we detailed just about an hour ago now, Lance Lynn. I'm also going to have a bunch of different lineups in these tournaments, also known as GPPs, is because of all the different pitchers we do like today. There's not one guy that completely sticks out that is just an automatic play or like some people like to refer to as just the plug and play with the chalk. But there are some guys that I'm definitely going to have in pretty much all of my lineups in terms of batters. Adam Jones, one of those guys. Lorenzo Cain, who Benny just mentioned, and I wrote a piece on him on RotoCurve earlier this week, is just he's so far under-owned and underpriced, but he's producing like one of the top 10 players in daily fantasy baseball right now. Another guy is Matt Kemp. But in order to afford those guys, we're going to have to put in those cheaper guys. So I like Derek Norris. I like Will Middlebrooks. And if he starts, he's another cheaper player, is Yangervis Solarte, who will probably hit in the top 5 of that order for the Padres, but only if he starts. Be sure to check out the lineups page and double-check to see if he's in the lineup. So I'm going to be spending on pitching in 50-50s and head-to-heads, which is always advised if they have good matchups. But I think today is going to be a hitter's day. We talked about all these great matchups. So, Benny, what are you going to be doing? Are you spending big on bats today?
I'm going to try. Let me say it that way. In my 50-50s, my head-to-heads, all the cash games that I'm playing, the pitchers that I have the most faith in today are Colin McHugh and Francisco Liriano. Neither one of them is cheap, but neither one of them is incredibly expensive either. So you can build teams on DraftKings or on Fantasy Aces, the two-pitcher sites, by putting both of those guys in and building around them. Now, as we said before, in order to do that, you're going to have to go cheap somewhere. So I'm going to agree with Josh. A guy like Derek Norris, the price is just way too good to pass him up. A guy like Middlebrooks, the price is way too good. And even some of the guys that I gave you at first and second base, a guy like Lucas Duda, who's very cheap on DraftKings, a guy like Daniel Murphy, who's cheap relative to what he could produce for you. Those are the kind of guys in like that 3,500 to 3,800 range that you're going to need to fit in there here and there if you do want to pay up for pitching and still get some of those big sticks in the outfield. Like I said, if I can afford and where I can afford D. Gordon, I think D. Gordon's going to be a stud today. I think he's got a good chance for multiple hits, good chance for stolen bases, a good chance to score some runs. So he's a guy that I'm going to try to fit in my lineup wherever I can. And then, as we said with those outfield bats, Kemp is in a great spot. Brantley's in a great spot. Adam Jones is in a great spot. These are all guys who you're going to have to try to fit a couple of them into your lineup. If you can you definitely need at least one of those guys in your lineup, whichever one you like best. I would think that at a minimum you want to try to get 2 of those 4 guys that we mentioned between Kane, Jones, Brantley, and Kemp. If you can get 2 of those guys into your lineup without having to take guys that you really don't feel strongly about in other places, I would think that that's almost a no-brainer for you. And in some of my GPPs, like Josh had said, there's tonight on DraftKings they have the $500,000 slugfest. I was lucky enough to win a couple tickets into that. So on some of those rosters, I'm going to want to really pay up for bats. So I'm probably going to be mixing and matching, 3 of those 4 outfielders that we said. So I'm probably going to need to look for, a couple of those really cheap value options at some of the other positions in order to make it work. One thing for GPPs is, sometimes you may want to go really low with your pitching, try to catch lightning in the bottle with one of those cheap guys. So a guy like Travis Wood, who Josh mentioned, is an option. Another guy who I like that's really cheap is Nick Martinez. I don't know why. We targeted against this guy all last year. This year, though, he seems to be pitching a lot better. If you look at his stats, his actual peripheral numbers, his numbers are better across the board. I mean, his strikeouts are up, his walks are down, he's giving up less hits, he's obviously giving up less runs. I think he's only given up like 1 run through his first 2 starts. So there's a guy who's priced down at like 5,300 on DraftKings. So if you are playing in a GPP tournament, he's somebody that might be worth including. But again, for my cash game, I want the safest pitchers I can get. So for cash game, I'm looking at guys like McHugh, guys like Liriano, guys like John Neese. And depending on how much money I need for my bets, those are going to be the 3 guys that I'm rotating in and out, depending on their price on different sites. On FanDuel, I would be using one of those 3 guys on top of my FanDuel rosters if it's a one-pitcher site, because I think that you need to pay up in those spots to get the best guys that are there. So that's basically the way that I'm looking tonight. There's a lot of stuff going on in the industry. I'll have a lot of cash games out there, and I'll probably also have a couple different lineups in those GPPs as well. So hopefully we can get lucky tonight and hit a big one and kind of pay for the rest of the season. That would be nice.
That sounds good to me. That brings us right to the top of the hour. One thing we did want to mention, RotoCurve is soft launching a point system today. So you go on and sign up, and you get a point for any time you post, any time you log in, any time you do anything on the site, you can get a point. And you will be able to use these points in the future, whether you can get RotoCurve gear, eventually you might even be able to get money to play on these daily fantasy sites. They're also going to have a badge system, which you can get more badges, you can get even more stuff. So be sure to sign up if you haven't yet on rotocurve.com. It takes about 41 seconds tops, and that's if you have a slow internet connection. On rotocurve.com, be sure to sign up. We will see you tomorrow, April 22nd at noon Eastern Time. Be sure to check out the rest of the DFS tools. A lot of new stuff is up on the site. Follow RotoCurve on Twitter, myself at Josh Galacci, and Benny at BennyR11. As always, you can see us on anywhere on the site. You can watch this on podcast. You can watch any of our other episodes so far. And as always, Benny has something else to say to wrap us up.
That's right. Good luck tonight, everybody, and stay classy, DFS.